Satisfying constraints is critical to the success of any advanced work packaging program. The research completed by the Digital Threads team provides a systematic approach to communicate and visualize AWP Digital Threads to stakeholders across the capital project's supply chain. The findings of this team will increase supply chain visibility and involve stakeholders in more effective supply chain decision-making and coordination. Here to present their findings, please welcome Yong Cho, Eric Marks, Brian Kendig, and Ted Weissman.
Good morning. This is Brian Kendig. I have the privilege and honor to introduce to you our work, the AWP Digital Threads to enable supply chain visibility, to introduce the work and the team. I'm with Dow Chemical. I'm the technical resource leader at Dow. My background is about 31 years in industry, 17 years as a supplier, 7 years as an EPC, and 7 years as an owner company. My background has given me the opportunity to work always on the interface of providing and buying and installing and commissioning major equipment for capital projects. And I'd like to offer a little bit more background into this project. As I mentioned earlier this morning, it was brought forward by John Walker and Ted with Constructex. But as early adopters of AWP, there were some gaps identified, and the gaps were related to the uptake of the AWP by suppliers. Suppliers can be the weakest link, this team has put together some work that will help the practitioners of AWP. This graphic that we're looking at shows silos, walls between departments of a company. Information is not flowing freely, and so you end up with a product that wasn't expected. On the far left, the illustration says marketing, but you could easily put in front of marketing suppliers as well. So the supply chain digital threads are going to improve the flow of information to provide a proper AWP application. There are two unique areas that we're going to highlight with our project. One is the supply chain digital threads themselves, and then secondly will be the material responsibility matrix. So if you could go to the next slide, please. We used a 5-step methodology in our program. The first step was to identify and review critical AWP digital threads. The second step was the Supplier Digital Thread Survey. I'd like to mention a quotation or a thought from a famous author, Malcolm Gladwell. He's written a number of books. I think one is called Tipping Point. Malcolm talked about, if you want to affect change, you must involve those who would be impacted in the development of the change. And I think, again, some of the early practitioners of AWP have found this was a weak link. We can theorize and put together the appropriate digital digital threads, but if we don't involve the suppliers in the process, our chance of success is greatly diminished. So that was one of the highlights of what we did, and later on, Eric is going to provide some details into that. Step 3 was the owner digital thread comparison. So we have a number of owners on the team that have been practicing AWP. The team had to create a composite to move forward and develop offer further development of our digital threads. Step 4 was a development of a material responsibility matrix. You're going to see a demonstration of that today. This into a fantastic tool, which will be also very useful in addition to the Supplier Digital Threads. This will help delineate who supplies what, owner, supplier, contractor. And step 5 was the creation of the AWP Digital Thread visibility web tool, again, which will be available to you all. So next slide, please. So what you're seeing here is the user interface homepage. Each of the dark tabs in the right column are our supply chain digital threads. They're categorized into virtual work package development and virtual construction model assembly. Several digital thread packages were identified for supply chain visibility. Again, you'll be hearing about the details later on. This screenshot shows the homepage of the Material Responsibility Matrix user interface, which is one of our project team deliverables. Categories of input information for the Material Responsibility Matrix include stakeholders listed as responsible parties, material groups, and material commodity and equipment type. So I'd like to introduce the team. And again, I feel privileged and honored to be with this team. That I would say the heavy lifting was by others besides myself. So there's credit that belongs to all these people on the team for a job that involved a lot of work. Yong Cho, Eric Marks, Yojin Jiang of Georgia Tech. I want to give special recognition to them as our project leaders and project managers. Eric Crivella, Justin Weaver, Ann Randall, John Fish, Manoj Dardwadkar, Keith Parker, Jamie Gerbrecht, Silvana Lara, John Walker, Ted Blackman, Robert Blackman, Shiv Sharma, Ted Weitzman, and Adam Messersmith. It's been fantastic working with this team. And you can see we have a very diverse makeup between technology companies, EPCs, and owner-operators. So thank you to the team members. Not everyone's going to be speaking today, but their hard work is going to be represented. So as you hear the various parts of our work, this can symbolize where, what we're trying to avoid on the left, and organizing data inputs to get to where we need to be on the right. So I'm going to now turn this over to Ted Weitzman. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Very much appreciated. And I am Ted Weitzman. I'm Director of Delivery Excellence for ConstructX. And I'm guessing that most people were on the previous session and heard my introduction before. I'll add a little bit to it, maybe a little more personal information. I live in Atlanta, Georgia. Have for most of my life, though I wasn't born here. I have 3 kids from the ages of 2 to 11, 2, 5, and 11. One just started kindergarten and one just started 6th grade. So the virtual learning experience here in my community has been interesting, especially with the kindergartner. And I want to echo again the pleasure it was working with both of these teams. As Brian mentioned, they were what I would consider special in the context of my experience within CII and the products that they produced. And you'll see the product here at the towards the end of this presentation today, and just feel it was an honor to be a part of both teams. And what I want to do, if we can go to the next slide, is talk a little bit about the motivation behind this project, and also in this section, and I'm going to come back a little bit later after Eric Marks talks for a bit, and talk about a little more in-depth detail about what the team executed with Eric. But the motivation here, really want to articulate, and if you could hit the next button, these 2 points. And I love the way that this RT 344 described this, moderate to extreme barriers to visibility improvement in supply chain. And you'll see, I'll consider these the extreme barriers up at the top were 2 IT system related issues. One, material data not in the IT system, and very likely because it was incompatible with the IT systems. And so when you look at this as an impediment to improving supply chain visibility, you've obviously got an issue that is technology related. And I had the honor of being the chair of the technology committee when this third project that was going to be funded by the committee was greenlit for execution. And that was last year, right around the time of the annual conference, and right at the same time the request for AWP data requirements as presented in the last session was requested very specifically by owners. And that carries us into the next slide, where there was obviously some overlap, not only between the work that the data requirements team was doing and this research team was executing, but also just in the very general landscape of AWP as it was being researched and reported on within CII. And as we kicked up the data requirements team, and as we knew that this project was being greenlit and there was going to be considerable overlap, which we'll see in a minute, it really spawned the creation of that AWP joint working group to make sure that we had representation from all aspects of AWP being executed within CII, basically to support this data requirements and digital thread work. But it goes beyond that. And again, that joint working group, that AWP joint working group that was formed, lives on as a subcommittee within the AWP CBA. And again, that's kind of a call for participation. If this work has interested you, it just starts here. This is just the beginning, and there's a lot more work to do. So if you scroll to the next slide, over the past year, as I would say information was leaking out from participants in this research and in these working groups, a lot of questions were coming back to both these teams about, well, is it one project? Is it two projects? Why is it two projects? What's the difference between a digital thread and a data requirement? And over the past year, we've been addressing those as they've come up. But I think in the context of these report outs, a lot of this is being addressed. But I'm going to focus in here and say that this committee, TC03, Technology Committee Project 3, was very laser focused on digital threads with their data requirements, very specific to supply chain. And they also had the, as a charter or as the impetus scope for that work, the charge to create a web tool and database to visualize data sharing and the roles associated with them. I'll talk about the roles later on a little bit as it relates to the materials responsibility matrix. The joint working group we just had a full presentation on, was really broad across all of the phases of a project execution, not just supply chain or supply chain visibility. It was all data requirements for AWP. And that was really to feed, as we discussed in the last one, a major focus was on that early contract language development and strategies for execution of the project, right? Where this supply chain visibility was really honed in on what data do you need and how do you actually light up visibility of your supply chain in the context of an AWP execution. I hope that makes some sense. If you need some further clarification, please feel free to reach out to me or anybody on this team, and we'll respond. And if you can go to the next slide. And from here, I'm going to hand it over to Eric Marks. I'll be back in just a little bit to dive a little bit deeper into the work that was executed.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. So as Ted mentioned, my name is Eric Marks, and I'm a professor of the practice at Georgia Tech. I'll be speaking mainly about the research methodology and outcomes of our data collection and analysis effort on this project. Next slide, please. Our overall research purpose was to promote and expand CII's current body of knowledge that focused on AWP and supply chain topics. You'll hear throughout this presentation that much of the information review originated with original results from previous CII projects. Our overall objective for the project was to create an open source digital library in an interactive web format containing specifications of the AWP digital threads for supply chain visibility. And finally, there at the bottom, our research scope focused on supply chain digital threads on capital projects. As Brian discussed previously in the introduction, our team's research methodology is best described in the 5 steps that you see on the slide. These steps helped us to review, validate, and publish the supply chain digital threads in this online environment that we'll speak about later in this presentation. And then each of these steps that you see on the research methodology figure We'll describe in detail and talk about the methods and then ultimately the results from those steps. The outcome of our first research step was the generation of the critical AWP digital threads integrated with supply chain topics. Next slide. So the figure that you see on this slide was borrowed from CII's Research Team 272. Each data requirement shown in the green boxes was categorized by project stage shown in the headings at the top row of the figure. These data requirements were reviewed by our research team members to select those that were critical to supply chain applications. The digital threads shaded in yellow were deemed supply chain critical by members of our research team. Our digital threads were not organized by CII's Research Team 272 project stage approach, but rather by likeness of their content. As previously discussed, members of our research team were closely aligned with CII's AWP Joint Working Group, so that finalized content of the supply chain digital threads was shared and populated with the data requirements of the Joint Working Group. A portion of our methodology included collecting input information from supplier companies that were often part of capital projects with our team members. We felt it necessary to get input from this group of stakeholders to better understand the viability of implementing these digital threads. This slide shows information about the supplier survey. We had 7 total supplier companies that participated in the survey. They all had varied annual sales in 4 commodity categories, including structural steel, mechanical equipment, pipe spools, and electrical equipment. Our survey questions included topic areas of supply chain data transmission frequency, available information, current use of technology for data sharing, and viability of implementing our research team's digital threads. Highlighted results of the survey indicate the following. Most of the survey participants agreed that they will not need to invest in new technology or add new personnel to implement our digital threads. Most participants felt they will need to review commercial proposal policies to implement our digital threads. Most participants shared that they will benefit from implementing our digital threads, and most share that they already provide much of the required digital thread information that we're requesting. Our research team also solicited input from owner organizations to validate our generated digital threads associated with supply chain topics. Our research team reviewed data requirements unique to 2 interviewed owners. Our research team reviewed pipe information categories and steel information categories from both of those owner companies. Although the individual owner company data requirements did not perfectly align with our digital threads, our research team members reviewed all discrepancies and found that all information categories identified by the 2 participant owners were captured somewhere in our digital threads. So now I'll hand it back over to Ted, who'll speak about the digital threads and the material responsibility matrix.
Excellent. So I'm going to dive into a little bit more detail here about the digital thread format. And again, a lot of this was based on the IP donated by ConstructX related to the digital thread framework showed in the previous presentation for the data requirements. So if you can go to the next slide. Very similar here as already described, and there was definitely coordination between the 2 teams. This team had selected the 7 categories of digital threads that were relevant to supply chain visibility. You see them here. If you click the next button, we're going to actually focus in on one of the categories, which is pipe detailing. Go ahead to the next slide. And what you'll see here is that this is DT190. And DT190 is actually composed of 3 sub-threads, 01, 02, and 03. And these are embedded within these would be the data requirements for that particular subcategory, very similar to the data requirements team previously. Also documented here is the timing and frequency of the required data within that subthread. And this is one of the differentiating factors between a data requirement and a digital thread. A digital thread is far more than just the documentation of the data requirement. The digital thread should document all aspects of the business process that the data is related to in order to actually make it function within a project execution. I'm going to articulate that again. the differentiating factor between a digital thread and a data requirement is that a digital thread should also document the business process that the data requirement is related to in order to actually execute it in the context of a project. That is super critical in the differentiation between a data requirement and a digital thread. So this team went one step beyond the data requirements team in preparation for this report out and trying to document more of the business requirement related to the supply chain digital threads. If you go to the next slide, this is where very similar, and this is what Eric articulated, this is in line and identical to the data requirement that was prepared by the AWP data requirements team. So there's perfect alignment here between the actual data requirement documented for CII between these two scopes of work. And we addressed some of the questions related to that last session. So I think we can move on and talk about the material responsibilities matrix. So the material responsibility matrix was another bit of IP donated by ConstructX for this particular project. And what the materials responsibility matrix does in the form that's presented here with this team is allow a set of project managers to clearly identify the materials stakeholders for a project. If you go to the next slide. In the categories of all materials or commodities. And what it does further as a responsibility matrix in a RACI style tool is allow you to identify who's accountable, who's responsible, who is going to just be communicated to or be asked to coordinate or communicate about the particular digital thread or materials or commodity in question, and also identify that critical piece of timing and responsibility as it relates to that material or that commodity. And it should align with the digital thread, which is why I kept on saying that in the data requirement, because it's not just about dates and when things will physically be on site. It's also should expand into who's responsible for providing what data at what point or points in a project. And you're going to see a demonstration of this tool in just a minute as it is product of this research team. And from there, we're going to Professor Yong Cho.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yong Cho. I'm a professor in civil and environmental engineering at Georgia Tech. And I'm also serving on the CII Technology Innovation Committee as an academic advisor. Next, please. I'd like to introduce a web tool to visualize the digital thread for supply chain and material responsibility matrix. This is the web address for the web tool, and this is a temporary website for pilot test for the web tool, and then this will be migrated to the CII website later. This is the home page of the web tool. Let me introduce the structure of the contents from the left menu here. There are two main functions, one for digital thread data specification for supply chain, and the other one is a material responsibility. Once click the digital thread for supply chain here or here in left menu, and then 7 digital thread as our team member previously introduced. Let me click one of the DT procurement, then you will see 5 sub packages here or here left hand side menu, and then those are related to procurement with their definition and overview. If we click one of them, you will see the data requirement specification with sample entries. It is the same information that you can find from the Joint Working Group's Data Requirement Specification and Implementation Guideline. If you want to see other digital thread, you can click here, and then you can see more of the other sub packages related to this digital thread. So I just briefly introduced digital thread supply chain website. Let me move to material responsibility. Once you click the material responsibility, you will see this page. There is a user's manual how to use a material responsibility matrix, specifically there's a movie clip tutorial how to use this website. And to use this material responsible matrix, first we have to define 3 groups of information. First one is who is responsible. Second one is what type of material we're going to handle. Third one is specifically what item, what type of commodity and equipment type in each material will be used. So we have to define these 3. After that, we can assign who is responsible for which material, commodity, or equipment type. Those are the overall process this interactive web tool will provide as a functions. First, we have to customize responsible parties. There's default information here, and nice thing about this web page is you can add, delete, or edit the information. So now demonstrating adding contractor B as a new information. So put the information of the contractor B, and then you can add here, and then you can see the bottom. There's a new information is added. So, or you can edit if you edit if you want to add ID, or and then after that you can save it. Sometimes you don't want it, then you can delete such a default information. Or you want to go back to original default, you can just reset the table. Also, you can add, edit, delete, and reset the material groups in the same way. Also for material responsibility, go back, and then material commodity and equipment type. In the same way, we can add, edit, delete, even reset. If we click MLM, we can see the list of all materials. And this is how to assign a responsible person to each material commodity. These are just showing the quick link. We can go back and forth by clicking those links to specific page. So there are engineering, procurement, and construction phases. We can assign responsible parties for each material commodity. This is a concrete, as an example, as a material, specific concrete material. And finally, we can download those data as an Excel file. So you can use this one as a local file. If we want to see overall material, you can see here overall material, entire MRM, and we can edit. If some of the material type you don't want to see, you can always delete it, and then you can see those one is reflected in MRM page. There, those 2 materials are gone. And then finally, if we want to download all overall material type, not instead of individual material, you can download all this MRM as an entire MRM as an Excel file. And if we open this file, you can see this Excel file workbook. And then this is very useful when you want to locally modify or revise something quickly, and then saving as a backup file. But always data might be available in the website as well. I briefly introduced Web 2 for the digital thread supply chain visibility. Now, Brian Kendig et al. Will take over this presentation, and he'll talk about conclusion and recommendation for this project.
Thank you, Yong, for that demonstration. I'd like to take you into our conclusions and recommendations. So hopefully you saw in what was presented and the demonstration some applications that will be very useful to you as practitioners of AWP. What you saw is that digital threads for supply chain applications were reviewed and validated through suppliers and owners. That is attempting to address a gap that we've identified that the proposers of this project had identified. Created open source digital library facilitates supply chain visibility across stakeholders, and we'll look at our graphic in just a minute to illustrate that. The material responsibility matrix that you just saw organizes assigned material responsibilities for site personnel, which is extremely important as we employ AWP. The envisioned benefits of research deliverables include improved stakeholder alignment, increase in transparency through data sharing, and increase in efficiency for stakeholders through proactive planning. Next slide, please. So recall the graphic where we had silos, information was not flowing from stakeholder to stakeholder. There was no line of sight from one person to their neighbor or one person to the people far upstream. So this is what we have with data in silo and no line of sight. You end up with an end product that's not very successful, not meeting the specifications. Next slide, please. So if we clearly delineate who supplies what, which would be a material responsibility matrix, if we include suppliers in the process of developing the supply chain digital threads, if we are clear in our digital thread requirements for suppliers, and if we include the business process in the transmittal of the data, which was a key point that Ted had mentioned, we will successfully deploy AWP. And as you see here, we've taken down the silos. You've got a clear line of sight, people able to recognize the data for their individual work process, and you have real collaboration coming. So a great success, a way to employ AWP. Next slide, please. So the lessons learned. Trust and transparency can be improved by standardizing digital thread information between owners and suppliers. The relationship aspect is very important for that. We obviously can't work in silos without involving suppliers. There's a lot to be learned, and the output that you'll see, the details in the study, can give you some concrete examples of that, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. Automated databases housing AWP digital threads information can promote efficiency of communication across the supply chain. And again, our envisioned benefits are the improved stakeholder alignment, increase in transparency through data sharing, and increase in efficiency for stakeholders through proactive planning. And I believe there's the next steps to discuss in the next slide. So the next steps are digital thread open source library can be modified to meet specific project requirements, and it's available to all of you. Material responsibility matrix core variables, materials, project stakeholders, and roles can be altered to match the project criteria. You can onboard this onto your applications very easily. Organizations can begin implementing the AWP digital threads for supply chains, including digital web tools to enhance communication and transparency on a project, which is a tremendous benefit. The early adopters, of AWP can tell you some of the issues that they've had, and with some of the supply chain aspects. And this study will give you the benefit of that learning. And then the digital threads visibility can be extended to cover all aspects of AWP data requirements beyond supply chain. So I want to thank you for your interest and your attention on behalf of the team that did the lion's share of the work, the presenters as well as those who didn't present. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.